other hand, has a simpler writing system, Hangul, but still has complex grammar.
Yeah.
So Japanese isn't necessarily harder than other Asian languages, it simply presents different challenges.
Yeah,
and
good.
this goes for
Fair.
any language out there, not just other Asian languages or Japanese. Each language will have its own unique challenges for you to overcome.
It is wrong to say, though, that all languages, I'm a little bit of a contrarian today, but hear me out. It is wrong to say all languages are equal. They're all equally difficult and in different ways. No. When we look at language difficulty, you can approach it in two ways. One, we can talk about objective difficulty, and then we can talk about subjective difficulty. Objective difficulty are those parameters that are objectively, like for instance, the Italian alphabet, it's objectively easier than learning how to read and write in both Japanese or Chinese. Also, it's not true that Chinese has more characters in the sense that if you know 2000 in either language, you are able to read and write. So you still need 2000. There are languages that are objectively harder when it comes to the grammar, that the pronunciation is harder. It is what it is. Some languages are harder than others. But when it comes to subjective, a lot has to do with your own personal talents. If you're really good at pitching up, if you have an excellent ear, then pronunciation is going to be easier for you than it is for someone else. And so that if pronunciation was one of the big issues in that language, then of course for you, objectively it's harder, but subjectively to you, it's actually not going to be a big deal. Likewise, if depending on what your first language is Spanish a difficult language? Well, of course, for an Italian, it's going to be easier than for an Anglophone. And that is because a lot of the words are very similar. And even more so for a Korean, Spanish is going to be a nightmare in comparison to an Italian or even a French, because we have a lot of words in common. And then the same thing can apply when you're trying to learn the kanji, but you're Japanese. You already know. You just have to learn how to read them in Chinese. And to say that all languages, they're all difficult in different ways, and therefore at the end of the day they're all equal, that's wrong. Not true.
It's important to remember that this is a very normal part of language learning, and that it doesn't mean anything about you or your ability in the language. It's important to approach challenging concepts calmly and allow yourself the time and patience to grasp them.
100% agree with her.
Certain grammar or vocabulary might not sink in immediately, and all it needs is a little time and patience for your brain to form those new neural pathways in order for you to understand, remember, and apply what you've learned. Ultimately, the hardest language to learn is the one you approach without the right mindset. With the right resources and consistent practice, Japanese can be just as...
And also passion. If you are passionate about the language, it's going to be a lot easier for you to put in the amount of hours that you're going to have to put in order to reach a reasonable level of fluency.
With the right resources and consistent practice, Japanese can be just as accessible as any other language. The next one is one that I've heard from a lot of people, and I've even thought to myself at times, and it's that kanji and grammar are notoriously difficult to grasp. However, and this might sound a little controversial, but kanji and grammar are only as difficult as long as you haven't started them, and are truly only as difficult as you believe them to be.
No. Kanjis are objectively difficult. The number of years, even for the Japanese, by the way. Again, I appreciate the positive thinking. Kanji are difficult. It takes a monumental amount of hours to memorize the strokes and the characters and all their varieties.
I get a lot of comments saying things like, "Oh, but Chloe, Japanese is only easier for you because you can read Chinese." And yes, while I did grow up speaking Chinese, which by the way has a pretty negligible impact on speaking Japanese because phonetics work so differently in both languages, I did not always know how to read Chinese. I had to take the time to learn the basic characters and build a foundation of kanji knowledge. Then I started writing and learning more about them. I was born and raised in Australia. I have never studied in a Chinese-speaking country like China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan before. And basically, what I'm trying to say is, I was not in an environment where I would naturally just learn how to read and write kanji had I not put in the time and effort into building those skills, which I could then transfer towards learning Japanese. You'll find that once you know the basic foundational kanji, More difficult kanji is simply a combination of multiple smaller kanji, and if you can draw those connections, you have a much easier time learning to read and write.
Yeah, I would say I agree with this. So basically, the idea is, in my experience, hit the first 800 kanji, and then the second 800 will be easier. You still have to commit them to memory, so the mnemonic aspect of it is still massive. But it's true that a lot of the kanji stop being new because the radicals, the components.
Learning kanji isn't something that should feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
And today's sponsor, Mochi Kanji, makes learning Japanese straightforward and manageable.
Lovely. I'll have to check the sponsor out.
About learning kanji in my kanji video, which I will link up here for you to watch later.
Check it out.
As for Japanese grammar, again, the same thing applies. What I figured is you kind of need to approach it with an open mind and understand Japanese from the perspective of a Japanese speaker as opposed to an English speaker or whatever your native language is. Let me explain what I mean by this. When you come across a new grammar structure, what you want to do is begin by breaking down and analyzing the different grammar rules it's combining and why it means what it does when it's put together in that certain way. For example, the grammar structure of a verb plus yo ni yotte wa means depending on how you do verb. Like depending on how you consider or think about something, we would take the verb kangaeru and do kangae yo ni yotte wa. If we break it down, we get yo, which means like the way something is, and when combined
Okay, so instead of just learning the sounds, you want to know what you're actually saying. Makes absolute total sense, yes.
the verb kangae yo, it would mean like the way someone thinks. And then we have ni yotte, which takes the verb yoru to depend on, with the directional particle ni, and all of that is in te form with the particle wa that marks all of that statement as the topic of the sentence. You don't need to think too much on this. However, when you start to have a general understanding of what the different elements of a grammar structure are, it'll make a lot more sense to you why they are used the way they are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's fair. That's fine. Children, when they learn a language, they don't really focus on grammar that much. They acquire it naturally, which is something I'd like to discuss on a dedicated video soon, how to pick up grammar naturally, like children do. But then again, to a child, if, for example, a sentence structure is made up of different words, those words, the child can recognize them, and so it's easier for them to learn it. So up to a certain extent, without focusing too much on the actual grammar rules, which once again, we don't learn when yet we reach fluency, so that should give you a hint on priorities. But understanding what the single components mean individually is actually a very good idea.
The next misconception is that Japanese is an isolated language. That is, it's its own standalone language because it's so different from others like English, and that's what makes it so difficult to learn. While it's true that Japanese belongs to a different language family than English,
I was gonna say,
and has a large number of differences from even other East Asian languages like Chinese and Korean, Japanese is a language that draws a lot of influence from other languages. Arguably, the most obvious influence is from Chinese, with the use of kanji and Chinese loanwords, particularly when it comes to concepts related to philosophy, governance, and religion.
I would say that Chinese stands to Japanese as Greek stands to Italian, in the sense that it's a language that used to be the center of power and culture, and then it influenced a lot of the high-end vocabulary. Of course, Latin playing a pivotal role in Italian too, but still, a lot of our words, like philosophia, obviously coming from Greek, a lot of those words do have that connection that it's very similar if you think about it between Chinese and Japanese.